There is a common assertion that historical arrows were constructed with enlarged nocks for ease of handling, so as to facilitate rapid reloading and a high rate of fire. And in truth, yes, there are many arrows, in particular ones from Persia and India, that feature bulbous nocks and wide string grooves. But the idea that these features were for speed loading is a rather simplistic and overzealous conclusion. Historical nocks such as these are not necessarily incompatible with loading quickly, but the alternative explanation for their design is not just more compelling, it's also far more complex and interesting. For example, although the slightly wasted shape of many of these arrows arguably does yield a marginal improvement in handling when grabbed by the nock end, this shape is actually a natural consequence of a completely unrelated design principle. Many of these projectiles were barreled or spindle shaped. That is, they were thickest at their center and gradually thinner towards the nock and point ends. Alternatively, many arrows had a tapered shape. They were thickest towards the point and then gradually thinner and thinner towards the nock. Both of these weight distributing practices has the potential to greatly improve stability in flight, and hence also improve accuracy, flight distance, and penetration. As a natural result of the shaft being so thin on its rear portion, the nock had to be flared outwards, not so much for ease of handling, but more so that sufficient material would remain for the nock to still be durable. A nock with thin, weak walls could break when shot from a powerful bow, potentially ruining not just the arrow, but the bow as well. Even so, it was not wise to make the nock excessively bulbous, lest it strike the handle and spoil the shot. Another aspect of the bulbous nocks is that they are advantageous when using the various forms of the augmented primary release. For example, there are these widened nocks that were used by the Lakota, who used a form of the secondary release to wield short, powerful bows on horseback. As for the width of the groove, the speed loading hypothesis ignores one hugely important consideration, and that is the thickness of the object with which the nock interacts, the bowstring. According to the book Excellence on the Bow and Arrow, which was composed circa 1500 AD in Morocco, the warriors of medieval Egypt placed a priority on power and cast, and as such they preferred thin, lightweight bowstrings modeled after the diminutive strings used for competition flight archery. Correspondingly, many Arab arrows and Turkish flight arrows feature narrow nock grooves of fairly uniform width, though interestingly enough, some later examples have carefully carved geometry that is almost identical to modern plastic nocks that snap onto the string. Their Persian counterparts, on the other hand, were said to have preferred vastly thicker strings, in some cases nearly as thick as a finger, considering them superior in every way. This statement is directly corroborated by the wide nocks commonly found on antique Persian arrows, and by arrows from regions under heavy Persian influence, such as the Mughal Empire in India. Other ethnic groups, such as the Manchu in China, are also well documented as using thick strings, and having appropriately wide nocks to accommodate them. Past authors from multiple cultures argued that although a wide string decreased speed due to its higher mass, it made the bow less temperamental and more accurate. Perhaps more importantly, the thickness added much needed durability. It was less stressful on the limbs, and it also greatly reduced the chance that the string would break, and quite possibly destroy the bow in the process. To quote the eminent English archer Roger Ascham, "In war, if a string breaks, the man is lost, and is no man, for his weapon is gone." In a related vein of thought, Ascham also makes a rather valuable comment with specific regards to nock grooves that are inappropriately wider than the string itself. The wide nock is not, both for breaking of the shaft and also for sudden slipping out of the string. Instead, he recommends the narrow nock, in other words, a tighter fitting nock, which avoids both those harms. He also says the deep and long nock is good, for it is good in war for sure keeping in of the string. Again, there is a clear focus on preventing damage to valuable and life-saving equipment by having the right fit of the string to the nock. Oriental authors said a nock should be not too wide and not too narrow. They also expressed quantitative terms for the fit, recommending that the nock width be 1/3 the circumference of the string. Not too tight, not too loose. Sound advice. To be perfectly blunt, the concept of a wide nock groove for speed loading is a blatant modernism. Instead, all the evidence seems to suggest that historical bowstrings and nocks were designed with a keen philosophy of keeping a careful balance between competing physical phenomena. Besides ease of use, archers also had to simultaneously consider power, precision, and maintaining the integrity of their weapon. These are immensely practical concerns that, collectively, are arguably far more important than shaving off fractions of a second in reload time. However, there is a type of nock for facilitating speed loading that was mentioned by authors of old. That is a nock where there are not one, but two grooves in the nock end. To my knowledge, there have been no recovered nocks of this type found in the archaeological record, and it is unclear if they were intended for war or merely for performances. The durability of such a nock is also somewhat questionable. There is the tantalizing possibility that Ascham was also well aware of such a nock, where he describes some arrows as having double nocks. However, it is more probable that he was merely referring to a nock reinforced with horn. The arrow does indeed have two nocks at right angles to each other, but one is filled with a sliver of horn to prevent the arrow splitting. In conclusion, hindsight and historical relativism can be double-edged swords. Oftentimes, we forget how some things used to be different, while other times we fail to recognize that a lot of things have fundamentally not changed.